Albert Einstein abandoned his schizophrenic son in an asylum for over 3 decades. Wernher von Braun built his rockets on a foundation of 20,000 dead slaves. Thomas Midgley Jr. poisoned the blood of an entire generation and punched a hole in the ozone layer. We are taught from childhood that these men, and others like them, were moral giants, that human progress is forged on the shoulders of greatness. We look at the names stamped onto our textbooks, the legendary thinkers, brilliant inventors, and pioneers of medicine, and naturally assume their ethics matched their intellect. We grant them an unwritten exemption from standard human decency under the comforting delusion that true brilliance must surely be accompanied by a grander human spirit. This great man theory of history, first formally championed by Scottish philosopher Thomas Carlyle in his 1840 lecture series on heroes, hero worship, and the heroic in history, is a lie. The raw historical ledger of human advancement is not a clean, upward trajectory of enlightenment we were fed throughout our formal textbook education. It is a forensic timeline of hubris, profound cruelty, and systemic silence. Facts that have been carefully hidden from us for generations. Today, with the help of advanced AI-generated images and real archival footage, we are shedding an unfiltered light on the truth, pulling back the curtain on these curated monuments to face what lies beneath. Before we unseal these files, answer this. Is it possible to truly separate the creation from the creator? If a breakthrough fundamentally changes humanity for the better, does the morality of the mind behind it even matter? Go down to the comments right now and let me know your raw take, because the figures we are covering today will test the absolute limits of your answer. Consider a name you likely never learned in school, yet whose work altered the literal chemistry of your blood. Thomas Midgley Jr. Midgley was an extraordinarily gifted mechanical engineer and chemist who set out to solve 2 mundane problems of the early 20th century: engine knocking in automobiles and the toxic dangers of early refrigeration gases. He solved both, and in doing so, single-handedly unleashed a dual atmospheric catastrophe that poisoned generations of children's brains and punched a hole through the Earth's ozone layer. After screening thousands of substances, Midgley discovered that adding tetraethyl lead to gasoline completely eliminated engine knocking. The commercial potential was staggering, but there was a fatal flaw. Lead is a potent, irreversible neurotoxin. Midgley and his corporate backers at General Motors knew this, deliberately branding the additive as ethyl to expunge the word lead from the public lexicon entirely. The human cost began immediately inside manufacturing plants. Workers exposed to production lines rapidly devolved into severe hallucinations, insanity, and death, a state they grimly labeled loony gas. Public health pioneers openly called corporate leadership murderers, and Midgley himself suffered severe lead poisoning in 1923. Yet, driven by pure corporate hubris, he chose to double down. On October 30, 1924, to quiet growing public panic, Midgley staged a grotesque public relations stunt. He stood before reporters, poured pure tetraethyl lead over his hands, and deliberately inhaled its concentrated vapor from a flask for 60 seconds, smilingly assuring the room that he could do this every day without harm. He knew it was a lie. Private corporate memos explicitly discussed using safe, clean ethanol as an alternative anti-knock agent, but ethanol could not be patented for a monopoly profit. Midgley's raw motivation was laid bare in a 1923 phone call to his associate Charles Kettering, the head of General Motors Research Corporation, where he reportedly boasted, "Can you imagine how much money we're going to make with this? We're going to make $200 million. Flush with cash, Midgley moved to his next breakthrough in 1930, chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, marketed as Freon. Once again, he demonstrated its safety by inhaling the gas and using it to blow out a candle. It took over half a century for scientists to realize that Midgley's miracle cooling gas was actively eating the planet's stratospheric protection shield, culminating in the massive ozone hole confirmed in 1985. Midgley's life ended with a poetic, mechanical irony. Stricken with polio later in life, He designed a complex, automated system of pulleys and ropes to lift his paralyzed body out of bed. On November 2, 1944, he became entangled in his own invention, and the machines strangled him to death. The coroner officially ruled his death by strangulation, though popular history largely leans toward a deliberate suicide born of desperation. Long after his death, the toxic legacy remains active. The Global Burden of Disease study attributes more than 3.5 million global deaths annually to lingering lead exposure, primarily through catastrophic cardiovascular damage. As environmental historian J.R. McNeil, author of Something New Under the Sun, famously observed, Midgley had more impact on the global atmosphere than any other single organism in the history of the Earth. If Midgley represents corporate greed masquerading as innovation, Dr. Henry Cotton represents the absolute horror of unchecked medical prestige. In 1907, Cotton was appointed medical director of Trenton State Hospital in New Jersey. A highly respected psychiatrist and student of elite European medical minds, he was driven by a singular obsessive hypothesis that all mental illness was not a psychological ailment, but a physical reaction to hidden, localized infections inside the human body. A discredited idea now known as focal sepsis theory. To prove his theory, Cotton transformed his state asylum into a forensic slaughterhouse. Around 1913, he began systematically extracting the teeth of mental patients, claiming oral bacteria leaked into the brain. When pulling teeth failed to cure their psychosis, Cotton did not question his logic. He simply decided the infection had migrated deeper. He escalated to surgically removing patients' tonsils, then their sinuses, and eventually transitioned to full abdominal surgeries. Without a shred of valid scientific proof, he began slicing open deeply vulnerable, unconsenting individuals to excise their colons, stomachs, ovaries, and testicles. These surgeries were performed before advanced antibiotics, often without basic hygiene and entirely without informed consent. Terrified patients were routinely dragged screaming to the operating theater. Over his tenure, Cotton's horrific surgical experiments directly mutilated thousands of victims, while his madness systematically stripped the teeth of thousands more. The mortality rate for his colectomies ran at an astonishing 30 to 45%, and hundreds died directly on his operating tables. Yet, to the medical establishment, Cotton was a visionary, boldly claiming a miraculous 85% cure rate by 1923. He maintained this illusion through chillingly deliberate statistical manipulation. When independent investigator Phyllis Greenacre, a psychoanalyst who would later become one of America's leading developmental psychiatrists, audited the hospital, she discovered that if a patient died immediately following an organ extraction, Cotton simply excluded their death from his psychiatric statistics, classifying them as casualties of physical complications rather than surgical failures. Greenacre noted that the vast majority of the surviving asylum population had been left entirely toothless and severely mutilated. Historian Andrew Scull, whose definitive account, Madhouse, a tragic tale of megalomania and modern medicine, remains the primary scholarly source on Cotton's crimes, described his operation as one of the most systematic campaigns of therapeutic brutality in American psychiatric history. The depths of Cotton's madness, however, were not reserved solely for his institutional captives. So utterly consumed by his own fanatical dogma, he turned the surgical blades on his own family. Convinced that hidden infections might one day cause mental illness in his household, Cotton forcefully had the teeth of his wife and his 2 sons removed as a preventative measure. He even had several of his own teeth extracted. The psychological trauma inflicted on his household was absolute. Both of his sons later committed suicide as adults. Cotton retired from the asylum in 1930 and died of a sudden heart attack in 1933, wrapped to the very end in the protective armor of professional prestige, leaving behind a legacy of thousands of destroyed lives built entirely on the foundations of unyielding medical megalomania. But while it is easy to look back at obscure historical monsters like Cotton or Midgley and brand them as anomalies, the systemic shield of genius doesn't just protect the names you've never heard of. The most terrifying sorting mechanism in history is the one that actively launders the household gods you worship today. Because the grandfatherly icon whose face sits on your t-shirts and the rocket scientist who built the American space age were hiding secrets that should have completely dismantled their legacies. And it turns out, the more universally beloved the genius, the darker the unredacted file. To understand how deep the whitewashing goes, we have to look at the cold mechanics of a man the world adored, Albert Einstein. To protect the great man illusion, history operates a massive sorting mechanism, separating the beautiful equation from the human rot that drafted it. There is no greater success story in this laundering process than Albert Einstein. In public consciousness, he remains the grandfatherly icon of physics, a gentle, wild-haired humanist who played the violin and spoke eloquently about global peace. But if you descend into his private archives and examine the raw, unredacted text of his personal relationships, the warm humanitarian disappears. In his place sits a chillingly detached domestic autocrat. By 1914, Einstein's marriage to his first wife, Mileva Maric, a brilliant physicist in her own right, was fracturing. Rather than navigating the separation with basic empathy, Einstein treated his household like a clinical laboratory, presenting Mileva with a written, non-negotiable contract of servitude if she wished to remain in his home. Mileva took their two young sons, Hans Albert and Edward, and fled Berlin that same year. But the clinical coldness Einstein applied to his wife was nothing compared to the absolute abandonment of his youngest child. Around 1930, his son Edward Einstein, nicknamed Tete, was diagnosed with severe schizophrenia. He spent the vast majority of his life confined to Zurich's Bergholzli mental asylum. When Einstein emigrated to the United States to claim his status as a global celebrity and academic deity, he left his sick son behind. When Albert Einstein died in 1955, he had not laid eyes on his child in over 3 decades. When Edward finally died alone in the asylum in 1965, a full decade after his father's passing, he had long since been shut out. Einstein's own written words regarding his son's condition reveal an almost terrifying lack of paternal empathy. "If only I had known, he would never have come into this world." His eldest son, Hans Albert, left behind a devastating 7-word summary of what it meant to be sired by a historical icon. Probably the only project he ever gave up on was me. If Einstein represents clinical detachment from personal empathy, Wernher von Braun represents a lethal, transactional calculation with human atrocity. In the mid-20th century, von Braun was celebrated as an American hero, a visionary aerospace engineer who appeared in space documentaries for Disney in 1955 and directed NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, ultimately leading the development of the Saturn V rocket that powered the Apollo program to put a man on the moon. He was the smiling face of technological triumph, but the foundation of his career was built on top of a mass grave. Before he was an American space icon, von Braun was a registered Nazi Party member since 1937, and by 1940, an active, high-ranking officer in the SS. He was the chief architect of the V-2 rocket program. When Allied bombing raids threatened his testing facilities, von Braun personally chaired high-level meetings that recommended moving the entire production apparatus deep underground into the Mittelwerk factory. To supply the massive labor force required, von Braun directly utilized the SS procurement chain to secure slave labor from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp system, a network of forced labor installations that formed part of the broader Holocaust machinery. Historical footage from the liberation of Camp Dora reveals the catastrophic human cost of von Braun's ambition. Prisoners were worked to death in pitch-black, freezing tunnels, deprived of air, sleep, and basic sustenance. Von Braun visited the Mittelwerk factory floor at least a dozen times, walking past emaciated bodies of slaves, fully aware of the horrific conditions. He knew exactly how his engines were being built, and he chose to keep optimizing the machinery. Wernher von Braun's V-2 rocket program holds a uniquely grotesque distinction. It remains one of the only weapon systems in history where the assembly line claimed far more lives via slave labor than the rocket strikes ever did on the battlefield. Twice as many humans were systematically starved and worked to death building his machines than were killed by their impacts in combat. Yet, because his mathematical genius was deemed a vital geopolitical asset for the upcoming Cold War, the United States government executed a massive, bureaucratic sanitization project. They scrubbed his files, laundered his reputation, and placed him on television screens as a wholesome pioneer of progress, proving that if your intellect is valuable enough, the state will gladly hide your victims beneath a paperclip. This leaves us with a chilling, inescapable question. Is cruelty actually the secret fuel of progress? Does a mind fundamentally have to be pathologically detached from human empathy to see what the rest of us cannot? When modern researchers finally unsealed the data and ran a forensic psychological audit on over 800 elite minds, they discovered a cold, transactional truth that completely shatters the myth of the great man. And the real reason history hides these monsters is far more calculated than you think. When confronted with this parade of historical atrocities, our brains naturally search for a pattern. We fall back on a romantic, dangerous myth that cruelty is the necessary engine of genius, and that to reshape human knowledge, a mind must be pathologically detached from basic empathy. But empirical research completely dismantles the idea that being a terrible person makes you a visionary. A landmark psychological study by researchers Delroy Paulus and Kevin Williams, published in the Journal of Research in Personality, analyzing over 800 elite achievers, looked directly at the clustering of dark triad traits: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. The data revealed that while these traits correlate modestly with climbing high achievement hierarchies, they do not spark intellectual breakthroughs. Narcissism simply acts as an accelerator for seizing power and recognition. The unredacted truth is transactional. Elite achievement demands a level of single-minded obsession that naturally mimics callousness. More importantly, high-prestige environments actively choose to tolerate and shield abusers to safeguard their own status. Cruelty doesn't create genius. Genius simply creates an institutional shield that ensures you can get away with being a monster. These dark stories didn't stay hidden by accident. They were systematically laundered out of public view by precise institutional mechanisms, government file laundering, and calculated academic silence. The ultimate administrative deception was Operation Paperclip. When United States intelligence officials realized the value of Nazi scientists like Wernher von Braun, they completely rewrote their histories. Personnel took classified files detailing von Braun's SS membership and slave labor operations, and physically masked them by pinning clean, newly generated political summaries over the top of the records using standard paperclips. The exact administrative action that gave the military operation its name. They buried mass murder under a piece of wire to engineer an American hero. The exact same laundering happens through academic inertia. Carl Pearson built the mathematical foundations used in almost every statistical analysis today. He was also a hardcore eugenicist who utilized his position as founder and editor of his own, unpeer-reviewed academic journal to publish pseudoscientific papers branding immigrant Jewish children as physically and mentally inferior. Yet, it took University College London until 2020 to finally strip his name from their buildings because his scientific prestige outweighed his human rot for nearly a century. Similarly, Nobel laureate Konrad Lorenz spent his post-war life pretending he had no part in the Third Reich. In reality, his primary 1938 Nazi Party application explicitly stated that his entire scientific work was devoted to the ideas of the National Socialists. He actively wrote scientific justifications for the weeding out of human beings, yet the University of Salzburg waited until 2015 to posthumously strip his honorary degree. History whitewashes its gods because institutions depend on the myth of the great man, Thomas Carlyle's dangerous intellectual legacy, to protect their own moral authority. We live in a world built by broken, dangerous minds. The math you use, the air you breathe, and the technology that defines your daily life were forged by individuals who frequently left a trail of human casualties in their wake. Puncturing the great man myth isn't about erasing their scientific discoveries. It is a fundamental shift in how we view authority. Human history is stunted when we demand our geniuses be saints, or assume that laboratory brilliance translates to a moral compass. Placing these icons on pedestals blinds us to the systems that protect them. Facing history with our eyes unredacted isn't an act of disrespect, it is a matter of necessity. Because progress shouldn't cost us our humanity. If you want to dig past the sanitized myths, hit subscribe right now. Share this video with someone who needs to see the real ledger of human progress and turn on notifications. We will see you next time inside the Unredacted archives.